When I saw her signature on that document, bold, clean, and unnervingly confident, I felt something inside me go still. It wasn't shock, not yet. It was more like the quiet that comes right before a storm tears everything apart. I remember sitting in the dim office of our father's attorney, the kind of room that smells faintly of old books and polished wood. The blinds were half closed, letting in stripes of afternoon light that cut across the table like prison bars. I had come there expecting closure, a few signatures, a few tears maybe, and the start of something new. Instead, I found betrayal inked on paper. My half-sister, Elaine. Her name looked so neat beside my father's, as if they'd been partners all along, writing the ending of my story together. The lawyer's voice had that practiced softness, the kind that professionals use when they know you're about to break. I'm afraid your father's revised will states that all property and assets are to be transferred solely to Ms. Elaine Parker. He paused before adding, "It appears he made this change 3 months before his passing." 3 months. That was during his final stay at the hospice, the one where I visited every weekend, fed him soup, held his trembling hands. The same hospice Elaine only came to twice, both times with perfect hair and perfume, strong enough to choke the lilies by his bed. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, a clerical error. My father wasn't a man of surprises. He believed in fairness, in balance. He taught me that life was about shared effort, shared reward. But as I sat there listening to the legal jargon swirl around me like smoke, I realized the unthinkable. Maybe the man who raised me had chosen her over me. Elaine didn't even look at me that day. She just gathered the papers, offered the attorney a polite smile, and said, "It's what Dad wanted." I just wish my sister could see that. Her sister. The word tasted bitter in my mouth. I remember the way her voice carried, a mix of pity and triumph, and how the lawyer avoided my eyes. I left that office with numb fingers and a heart full of questions I wasn't ready to face. Because betrayal from a stranger is one thing. But betrayal wrapped in family blood? That cuts differently. It doesn't bleed right away. It festers, quietly, until you wake up one morning realizing you've been hollowed out from the inside. I drove home that afternoon without music, without thought. The will papers lay on the passenger seat like a loaded weapon. Outside, the world looked perfectly normal. Families crossing streets, kids chasing each other under falling leaves. But inside, my world had tilted, and I wasn't sure it would ever straighten again. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table staring at my father's old watch, the one he'd given me on my 30th birthday. He'd said, "You're my anchor, Julia. You keep this family steady." But now the anchor was cut loose, and I didn't know how to keep anything steady anymore. I didn't sleep, and by the time morning came, I wasn't angry yet, just confused. I told myself there had to be an explanation, a misunderstanding, a missing page, something. But deep down, under all the denial, a small, cold voice whispered the truth I didn't want to hear. Elaine hadn't just taken what wasn't hers. She had planned it. That morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds like thin blades. I made coffee out of habit, though it tasted like nothing. The house felt too quiet, like it was listening to me think. Every object in that kitchen carried a piece of my father. His chipped mug, the clock he'd fixed 100 times, the faint scent of his aftershave that still lingered in the hallway. I tried to picture his face when he signed that will. Did he look tired, confused, or was he calm, trusting Elaine, the daughter he'd kept in the shadows for most of my life? She had appeared when I was 16. My mother was already gone by then. Cancer had taken her fast, before I ever understood how grief can fill a house like fog. Dad sat me down one Sunday and said, "Julia, there's someone I need you to meet." Elaine was 13 then, thin, quiet, with the same dark eyes as my father. I remember how she stood in the doorway of our living room, clutching a small teddy bear, looking at me like she'd stepped into a world she didn't belong to. And I guess in a way she hadn't. Dad said she was his responsibility. That was the word he used. Not daughter, not at first. It wasn't until years later that I learned the truth. She was the result of an affair, something that had begun while my mother was still alive. I didn't hate her then. I hated what she represented. But Elaine, she had this way of slipping into spaces without asking. By the time I left for college, she had taken over my old room, joined my father's weekend routines, and started calling him Dad without hesitation. Still, I believed he loved us both in his own way. That belief had held me together through all the small cracks that came after: missed birthdays, unequal gifts, whispered phone calls, until that will shattered everything. I found myself replaying every memory, searching for the moment he might have chosen her over me. The night he told me he was proud of the woman I'd become. The way his eyes softened when he saw me in my nurse's uniform. The Christmas before he got sick, when he handed me an envelope with a check and said, "For your down payment." He had wanted me to buy a home of my own. That home never happened. The money went into his care, and I never regretted it, until now. I picked up the phone that morning and called Elaine. She didn't answer the first time. The second time, her voice came through smooth, steady. "Hey, Jules, I figured you'd call." "Elaine," I said, trying to keep my tone level. "We need to talk about Dad's will." There was a pause, just long enough to tell me she was smiling. "There's nothing to talk about," she said. "It's all been settled. Dad made his wishes clear." "His wishes?" I repeated. "You mean the will you helped him revise while he was on morphine?" She inhaled sharply, then laughed. "Careful, Julia. That sounds like an accusation." "Maybe it is." I could hear dishes clinking on her end, the sound of a life that was already moving on, while mine had just stopped. "I'm sorry if you feel cheated," she said finally, her tone syrupy sweet. "But you know Dad. He was all about family. He wanted me to have what was already mine, and with that," she hung up. I sat there with the phone pressed against my ear long after the call ended, listening to the dial tone until it faded into silence. That was the moment I realized this wasn't confusion anymore. It was war. Before all this, before lawyers, signatures, and sleepless nights, life was ordinary. And ordinary, I've come to learn, is a blessing you only recognize once it's gone. Back then, my days followed a rhythm. I'd wake up before sunrise, make coffee in that old French press that sputtered like it was gasping for air, and sit by the kitchen window, watching the first light spill over the yard. My dog, Max, would nudge my knee with his nose, asking for his morning walk. I'd slip into my scrubs, lace my sneakers, and drive to the hospital while the rest of the city still yawned itself awake. I worked as a nurse in the geriatric unit. Long hours, small joys. The kind of work that taught me patience, and how fragile time really is. Sometimes when the world outside felt too loud, the quiet hum of hospital machines was oddly comforting. People came there to say goodbye, but they also came to hold on. I like to think my father understood that part of me. We weren't the kind of family that said, "I love you" easily. Instead, we showed it through gestures. A repaired fence, a hot meal, a ride home after a long shift. He used to say, "You take care of strangers the way most people can't even take care of their own." And I'd laugh, brushing it off, because that's just how we talked, circling around love without ever naming it. My father, Robert Parker, was a man of routine too. A retired electrician with calloused hands and an old Chevy that coughed more than it purred. Every Sunday, he'd visit the local diner for pancakes and black coffee, tipping the waitress like she was family. He didn't like change, not in his food, not in his schedule, and certainly not in his relationships. That's why the revelation of Elaine, years ago, had torn something deep between us. Still, as he grew older, I tried to bridge that gap. I visited every weekend, stocked his fridge, made sure his pills were organized. Sometimes he'd talk about Elaine, mostly in passing. "She's doing good at her firm," he'd say, or Elaine stopped by with some groceries. He always spoke like he was trying to balance the scales, reminding me that she existed, but that I was still his anchor. I didn't mind then. I told myself that forgiveness was a form of maturity. When his health began to fail, the slow kind of failing, the one that comes like a shadow stretching over months, I stepped in fully. Hospice care, paperwork, medical bills. Elaine lived only an hour away, but she rarely came. She said hospitals made her uncomfortable. "It's not my thing," she told me once, her eyes darting to her phone while I adjusted his oxygen tube. But Dad's face always lit up when she did visit. I'd stand in the corner of that room, watching them talk in hushed voices, their hands close, their laughter light. He'd look younger when she was around. And part of me, the part I tried to bury, felt jealous. Not because she existed, But because she got the version of him that smiled, when he passed, it wasn't sudden. He went quietly, like he'd rehearsed it. I held his hand until his pulse faded, whispering that it was okay to rest. Elaine arrived 2 hours later, mascara perfectly intact, carrying white lilies that smelled too sweet for a day like that. The funeral was small. A few neighbors, his old fishing buddies, some family we hadn't seen in years. Elaine and I stood side by side as they lowered him down. I remember the sound of soil hitting the coffin, dull, final, heavy. Afterward, she hugged me, or at least pretended to. "You did so much for him," she said softly. "Dad always said you were his angel." I wanted to believe her. I really did. For the next few weeks, life felt suspended. I kept expecting to hear his footsteps on the porch, his gruff voice calling, "Jules, you still drink that bitter coffee?" But silence became the new normal. I was the one who handled everything. The estate, the medical bills, the sale of his tools. Elaine offered help, but only in words. She was too busy, she said. "Work's been insane." Then one afternoon the attorney called. He said, "Ms. Parker, we're ready to review your father's will. If you and your sister could come in next week, we'll finalize the reading." That was the call that began it all. The call that turned ordinary life into something I'd soon barely recognize. The day of the will reading, I woke up earlier than usual. I don't know why. Maybe nerves, maybe instinct. The air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. I stood in front of the mirror, tying my hair back, trying to make sense of the reflection staring back at me. My eyes looked older, tired. Grief had a way of etching itself into your face when you weren't paying attention. I chose a simple black dress, the same one I'd worn to the funeral. Not because I didn't have other options, but because it felt appropriate. Funerals, lawyers, goodbyes, it all blurred together when loss was still fresh. The law office sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, a brick building with ivy crawling up its side and gold lettering that read Anderson and Tate, estate law specialists. Inside, everything smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. Elaine was already there when I arrived. She was dressed like she'd stepped out of a corporate magazine, gray suit, neat bun, red nails tapping rhythmically on the table. She smiled when she saw me, that tight kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "Julia," she said, standing just enough to make it look polite. "You look well." "Thanks," I replied, taking the seat opposite hers. The lawyer, Mr. Anderson, walked in a moment later, carrying a thin folder. He looked like the kind of man who never hurried, not even for fire alarms. He offered condolences first, then business. "The purpose of today's meeting," he began, "is to review the last will and testament of Mr. Robert Parker." I nodded, clasping my hands together on my lap. Elaine just leaned back, calm as still water. He started reading the preamble, the usual formalities about being of sound mind, signed witnesses, and so on. My thoughts drifted as his voice echoed through the quiet room. I imagined Dad sitting in this same office months ago, signing papers he probably didn't fully understand. His handwriting had been shaky toward the end. Then the lawyer cleared his throat and said, "All financial accounts, properties, and personal belongings are to be transferred to Ms. Elaine Parker." At first I thought I'd misheard. He continued reading, but the words blurred. "All properties, all assets, full rights and authority." "Wait, what?" I interrupted, my voice breaking through the calm like a crack in glass. "That can't be right," Mr. Anderson blinked slowly. "I assure you, Miss Parker, these are your father's signed instructions." "But," he told me. Elaine spoke up then, voice smooth as silk. "Dad made those changes a few months before he passed. He wanted to simplify things. You know how he was about paperwork." I turned to her, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Simplify? Elaine, you weren't even there when he was in hospice. You didn't sit with him. You didn't." "Julia," she said softly, like she was speaking to a child. "He wanted me to have it. He told me himself. He said he owed me that much." Mr. Anderson shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "The documentation appears legitimate, signed and notarized." I could barely hear him. My world had narrowed to the sound of Elaine's steady breathing and the tremor in my own hands. I stood up, pushing the chair back. "I don't believe this. My father would never." "Julia," she cut in sharply now, her tone losing its sweetness. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Dad wanted peace. I'm just following through. Peace." That word stung. Because whatever piece my father had left behind, Elaine had just burned it to ashes. I walked out of that office without saying another word. The autumn air hit my face like a slap, cold, bracing, real. Outside, the world looked unchanged. People crossed the street, cars honked, a man sold flowers on the corner, and I stood there, holding my father's absence in both hands, realizing I had nothing else left. That night, I drove to my father's house, the one I'd practically lived in for the past year. The porch light was off. Elaine's car was already there. She was inside, going through drawers like she owned the place. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, stepping inside. She didn't even flinch. "Packing up. Dad said I could have everything. That includes the house." "Get out," I said, voice trembling. "You don't get to—" She turned to face me, her expression calm, almost pitying. "Julia, I know this is hard, but this is reality. You need to let go, let go." The words hung between us like a verdict. I looked around that living room, the worn couch, the pictures on the mantel, the dent on the wall from when Dad dropped the toolbox. Everything in that house carried a memory, a life we'd built together. And now she was claiming it all. I left before I could say something I'd regret. But as I drove away, one thought wouldn't leave me. If she was lying, I'd find out. I didn't sleep that night. The walls of my apartment felt too close, the air too heavy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Elaine's face, that polished calm, that smug certainty. By morning, exhaustion had settled into my bones. But something else stirred beneath it, a quiet, simmering disbelief. I'd been raised to trust in fairness, in decency, in truth. My father had believed in those things too. If he'd really given her everything, why did it feel so wrong? So, I did what any nurse with a stubborn streak and too much time alone might do. I started digging. The first thing I did was visit the hospice center. The nurses there still remembered me. I'd spent more nights in that ward than I could count. "You were such a good daughter," one of them said as I signed in. "Your dad was lucky to have you." Lucky. The word hit me strangely now. I asked if they had any notes from his file, records of visitors, care schedules, that sort of thing. The receptionist hesitated. "We can't release medical files," she said carefully. "I understand," I said, keeping my tone calm. "But I'm not asking for medical records. Just the visitor log. For the last few months." She hesitated again, then looked around before lowering her voice. "Give me a second." When she came back, she slid a piece of paper across the counter. Dates, signatures, time in, time out. I traced my finger down the list. My name appeared over and over, Julia Parker, in neat, looping handwriting. And then, scattered in between, were a few entries under Elaine Parker. But something didn't add up. 3 of those signatures looked different. Too smooth, too practiced, not like the ones she'd used before. The nurse, Maggie, noticed my silence. "Something wrong?" I smiled faintly. "No, just thinking." But inside, my mind was turning. If Elaine had been visiting more often than I thought, why hadn't the nurses mentioned it? Why hadn't my father? And if she hadn't actually been there, who had signed her name? That night, I sat at my desk and compared old birthday cards from her to the hospice sign-ins I'd photographed on my phone. The loops on her E didn't match. The slant of the P was off. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Forgery. That's what it looked like. Of course, it wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was the first splinter in her perfect story. The next morning, I drove to Dad's house again. The place was quiet, too quiet. I half expected her car to be in the driveway, but it wasn't. I still had my old key, though it felt like trespassing now. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. The furniture had been covered with white sheets. The framed photographs were gone, every last one. Only faint outlines on the wall remained, ghosts of a life removed. In his study, the drawers were open, papers scattered. I began sorting through them carefully. Tax returns, old bills, letters. Nothing out of the ordinary. Until I found a small, leather-bound notebook tucked behind a stack of manuals. It was his handwriting. Shaky, uneven, but unmistakably his. I opened to the last few pages, my heart pounding. Elaine came today. Asked about the will again. I told her Julia will take care of things. She always does. Elaine insists I sign new documents. Says it's for clarity. I told her not now. My hand hurts. She brought a notary this afternoon. Said it was urgent. I didn't understand all of it. I stopped reading there, my breath caught somewhere between disbelief and fury. So he hadn't wanted to change the will. She'd pushed him, maybe even manipulated him. And if that's true, those new documents, the ones she claimed were his wishes, might not just be unfair. They might be illegal. I snapped a few photos of the pages, careful not to damage the fragile notebook. My hands trembled as I closed it and put everything back where I found it. When I stepped outside, the air felt colder, sharper. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something other than grief. I felt purpose. I called a friend from the hospital, Lauren. She'd worked in medical administration before switching to nursing. "Hey, weird question," I said. "How hard is it to notarize something if the person's in hospice care?" She hesitated. "Depends. Usually there's a witness, and they have to confirm the patient's mental capacity." "Why? No reason," I lied. "Just curious," but I wasn't just curious. I was certain. Elaine had planned this, down to the last detail. That night, as I sat on the couch scrolling through old photos of my father, I whispered out loud, "You didn't deserve this, Dad." And maybe, somewhere beyond the silence, I hoped he could hear me, because I wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. 2 days after the will reading, I went back to my father's house. It still smelled like him. Cedarwood aftershave and the faint trace of old coffee. Dust motes drifted in the sunlight as I stood in the living room, the one he'd spent 40 years building and 40 minutes losing. The shelves were still lined with the same books, the same family pictures. Except now, they felt like strangers staring back. Elaine had been here before me, of course. The real estate agent had mentioned she stopped by to organize paperwork. I should have known then that organize meant erase. Half the photo frames were gone. The one of Mom holding me as a baby, gone. The one of me and Dad fixing his old Ford, gone. But the ones with Elaine, oh, those were still there. Polished, centered, perfect. I stood there in silence for a long while, my fingers grazing the dust outlines of the missing frames. It was like she'd been editing his life, rewriting the story until she was the main character. Then I noticed something small, something out of place. Dad's desk drawer, slightly open. He never left drawers open, not even an inch. I pulled it gently, and inside, under a pile of envelopes, was a flash drive, unlabeled, ordinary. But it pulsed in my hand like a heartbeat. For a moment, I just stared at it, debating whether I even wanted to know what was on it. But curiosity and pain share the same DNA. You can't feel one without the other. So I drove home, plugged it into my laptop, and waited. There were only 2 files inside. Both videos, both dated the same day, 3 weeks before he died. The first one opened to the familiar image of my father sitting in his hospice bed. His voice was weaker than I remembered, but steady. "If you're watching this," he said, "then something has gone wrong." I froze. He looked right into the camera, right into me. "I've made mistakes, Julia. I tried to fix them the best I could." He coughed, his hand trembling slightly. "Elaine came by yesterday. She brought papers for me to sign. Said it was routine. I was tired. I didn't read them." My stomach dropped. He continued. "Later, the nurse told me she saw her with the lawyer's assistant. They were whispering about signatures. I don't know what they did, but if this message reaches you, check the papers." The video ended. I just sat there staring at the blank screen, my pulse roaring in my ears. My father had warned me. He had known. The second video was shorter. It was security footage, grainy, black and white from the hospice hallway. I saw Elaine walking in, holding a leather folder. A man followed, someone tall in a gray suit. They stepped into Dad's room. 10 minutes later they came out. Elaine was smiling. The man patted her shoulder. The timestamp on the video matched the date the lawyer mentioned, the day the will was updated. I leaned back in my chair, the air leaving my lungs in short, sharp bursts. This wasn't grief anymore. This was deception, planned, polished, signed in ink that hadn't even dried when my father took his last breath. I didn't sleep that night either. I replayed the video over and over until the screen burned into my mind. Every detail, every second, every smile she gave that man in the suit. And then came the question that changed everything. Who was he? The lawyer had said my father's documents were handled through an assistant. But this man, he didn't look like an assistant. He looked like someone higher, someone with access. By morning, I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was investigating. I called the hospice, asked for the nurse in charge of my father's care. She remembered Elaine. Oh yes, she said. The blonde woman with the red coat. Came twice. Always in a hurry. I asked if she'd ever seen a man with her. There was a pause. Then, yes, once. He said he was from the law firm. They spoke privately in the hallway. Your father seemed uneasy afterward. That was all I needed to hear. I hung up, heart pounding, and opened my laptop again. Elaine had always been clever, but she'd made one mistake, one small, arrogant mistake. She thought I'd never question family. She was wrong. 3 days later, I stood outside Elaine's house. It was one of those clean, quiet suburban homes that looked perfect on the outside. White fence, manicured lawn, 2 matching cars parked like trophies. The kind of place where betrayal shouldn't belong. But it did. I didn't tell her I was coming. I wanted to see her face before she could prepare it. When she opened the door, she blinked in surprise. Julia, wow, this is unexpected. Her tone was bright, casual, like she was greeting a neighbor dropping by for coffee, not the sister she'd stolen from. Can I come in? I said flatly. She hesitated just for a second, then stepped aside. Of course. The living room was all light colors and soft textures, creams, grays, and that faint scent of lavender she always loved. I took in the walls. Pictures of her and Dad, her and her husband, her and her son. Not a single one of me. She poured coffee like it was any other morning. I was actually going to call you, she said, sliding a cup across the table. We haven't really talked since you forged Dad's will? Her hand froze halfway to her mouth. The silence that followed was almost tender, like the room itself was holding its breath. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. I don't know what you're talking about. I pulled out my phone, pressed play. My father's weak voice filled the room. Elaine came by yesterday. She brought papers for me to sign. Said it was routine? She paled. The sound of his coughing filled the air, that soft, painful rasp that had kept me awake for weeks in the hospice. When the video ended, I said quietly, he knew. Elaine's eyes darted to the window, then to the floor. She set her cup down slowly. You don't understand, Julia. Then explain it to me, I said. Explain how Dad signed everything over to you while barely able to hold a pen. She exhaled sharply, her voice breaking into something brittle. He was going to do it anyway. He told me, don't lie to me. She looked at me, really looked at me then, and for the first time I saw fear. Not guilt, fear. I took a step closer. Who was the man with you? The one in the video? Her jaw tightened. He's a friend. A legal consultant. Name. Julia. Name. She flinched. Martin Keene. The name hit me like static. He was our father's lawyer's assistant, the one who'd handled the revisions. I leaned back, piecing it together. You paid him? No, she said quickly. No, I didn't. He offered to help. How much? Her silence was the answer. I laughed, a sound so hollow it startled even me. God, Elaine, you didn't just steal. You bought your way into his will. Tears filled her eyes. You think it was easy for me? You were always the favorite, Julia. You were the one he trusted, the one he loved. I was just the reminder of a mistake he made years ago. You think I didn't see it? Every birthday, every visit, I was always second. I stared at her, stunned. This is how you fix that? By turning his death into revenge? She slammed her hand on the table. You don't understand what it's like to be unwanted by your own father. Her voice cracked open, spilling years of buried resentment. And in that moment, for the briefest second, I saw the child she'd once been. Small, angry, desperate to be seen. But sympathy dies fast when deceit is still fresh. You had choices, I said quietly. You didn't have to burn everything to feel equal. She shook her head, tears streaming now. You think it's that simple? When he told me he was changing the will again, back in your favor, I panicked. Martin said there was still time to what? I snapped. To trick a dying man? She covered her face. He said it would just adjust the terms. I didn't know it would take everything. That's a lie. I swear, Julia, don't. My voice came out low, trembling. You made him sign those papers. You took advantage of a man who couldn't even stand without help. You took the last thing he had, his peace. Elaine sobbed. I thought I was protecting what was mine. Nothing about this was yours. The room fell silent again. except for the soft clinking of the coffee cup she'd dropped. Spinning slowly on the table like a broken clock, I looked at her one last time. There was nothing left to say. As I turned to leave, she whispered, "He forgave me, you know." I stopped. She was lying. But I didn't turn around. I just said, "Then I guess that makes one of us," and walked out. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house felt heavier than usual, like the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of everything I'd learned. I sat by the window, staring at the old oak tree outside, the one Dad planted when I was little. He used to say trees were honest creatures. They took their time, gave shade without asking for thanks, and never pretended to be more than they were. I wondered what he'd say now, if he'd still believe honesty stood a chance in a family like ours. My phone buzzed past midnight. It was a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the diner on 5th, 9 a.m. It's about your father's will." The dawn came pale and thin, painting the walls of her living room in washed-out gold. The silence was dense, a silence that felt earned, bought at a terrible price. The night before, I almost deleted it, thinking it was some cruel scam. But something about that timing, the way it came right after my confrontation with Elaine, made my stomach twist. The next morning, I sat at a corner booth of the old diner Dad used to take me to. The smell of burnt coffee and fried eggs hit me the moment I walked in, wrapping around memories I didn't want. Martin Keene was already there. Same suit, same polished hair, same face that never looked entirely trustworthy. He didn't stand up when I approached, just nodded, sliding a folder across the table. "I thought you'd want to see this before you make any decisions." I didn't touch it. "Why now?" he sighed. "Because Elaine's panicking. She thinks you'll take this to court, and if that happens, both of us lose." "Both?" I said. "Martin, the only person who stands to lose anything is you. You helped her forge those papers." He leaned back, eyes scanning the room before landing on me again. "You think she came up with that idea alone? She doesn't have that kind of mind for detail." My blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," he said quietly, "your father didn't just change his will for her. He intended to leave you the business, Julia, all of it. But Elaine wanted her share, so she came to me. Offered me 30 grand to make sure the signatures said otherwise." 30,000? I whispered. He nodded. "She paid half before and promised the rest once it cleared probate." I stared at him, the diner noise fading into static. "You betrayed my father's dying wish for $30,000? His jaw tightened. "Don't make me the monster. You think I don't regret it? I lost my job over this, my reputation. She promised it'd stay quiet. But guilt has a way of clawing back." I finally opened the folder. Inside were copies of emails between Elaine and Martin, cold, transactional lines that read like the blueprint of betrayal. "He won't know what he's signing. Just make sure my name's on everything. Once it's finalized, I'll make sure you're taken care of." Every word felt like another nail in a coffin I didn't know was mine. I closed the folder slowly. "Why are you giving me this?" He rubbed a hand over his face. "Because she's planning to sell the house. The one your father built. I thought maybe you'd want to stop it." The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and white. I wanted to scream. Instead, I took a deep breath, steadying my voice. "You know this doesn't make you noble," I said. "You're just trying to save your own skin." He gave a small, humorless smile. "Maybe, but at least now you know what really happened." When I walked out, the air felt colder. The morning sun glared against the car windows, as if it too was ashamed to witness what people could do for money. I drove straight to the county recorder's office. They had records of every property transaction, every will filed. And there it was, my father's will, stamped and filed under Elaine's name. But when I compared the signature on it to one from Dad's old medical forms, the difference was painfully obvious. Dad's real signature had always been confident, a sweeping R, followed by a looping tail. The one on the will trembled, uneven, like a hand forced to move before it was ready. I held the papers against the sunlight. The ink density didn't match. Parts of it looked photocopied, forged. That was the moment my grief turned into something sharper. Not rage, not yet, but a kind of cold, surgical determination. I called a lawyer that same day, a soft-spoken man named Grant, who'd known my father through the Rotary Club. He listened quietly as I laid everything out. The recordings, the emails, the forgery. When I finished, He leaned back, fingers steepled. You've got enough for a civil claim and possibly criminal charges. But be prepared, Julia. This will get ugly. I nodded. It already is. He hesitated. Do you want revenge? Or justice? I looked out his window. The world outside went on. People walking dogs, kids chasing pigeons, a man sipping coffee like nothing was broken. I just want my father's truth to mean something, I said. That night, I filed the lawsuit. Elaine called the next morning. I didn't answer. Then came a text. How could you do this to me? We're family. I stared at it for a long time before typing back. Family doesn't forge your father's will. Then I turned off my phone. For the first time since Dad died, I felt something close to peace. Not the kind that comes from healing, but the kind that comes from finally standing up. Courtrooms have their own kind of silence. Not the calm, respectful kind, but the tense, airless kind, where truth and lies sit side by side, waiting for someone to notice the difference. When my case was finally called, I stood there in that polished wooden room, heart pounding so hard I thought the clerk might hear it. Elaine sat across from me, sleek black suit, pearls, hair tied back like she was about to host a charity gala instead of defend a forgery. She didn't look at me. Not once. Grant leaned in. Remember, he whispered, you're not here to prove she's a bad person. You're here to prove the documents are fake. I nodded, even though my hands were shaking. The judge entered, an older woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that didn't tolerate drama. She glanced between us. Let's begin. As the lawyer spoke, I drifted in and out of the words. Legal terms filled the air. Probate, intent, undue influence. Words that tried to make something so deeply personal sound sterile. I caught snippets of Elaine's lawyer arguing that the will was entirely valid, that Mr. Reynolds was of sound mind. My father hadn't been of sound body, let alone mind those last days. When Grant presented the recording of Dad's voice, the one where he mentioned the papers Elaine brought, the courtroom fell quiet. Hearing his voice again nearly broke me. I gripped the edge of the table, fighting tears. Elaine finally looked up then, not at me, but at the floor, her face drained of color. The judge asked, Ms. Reynolds, would you like to respond? Elaine stood, her voice trembling. That recording is incomplete. My father knew what he was signing. He wanted me to have what he promised. He loved me. I felt something twist in my chest. Love had become her shield. Maybe that's what hurt most. She truly believed the lie she built. When the session ended for the day, the judge called for recess. As we stepped outside, the cold spring air hit my face, and I finally exhaled. Grant said quietly, She's scared. That means she knows the truth won't stay buried. I nodded, but I wasn't celebrating. Winning wouldn't bring Dad back. It wouldn't erase the months I'd spent doubting myself, wondering if I was overreacting. Justice didn't feel like a victory. It felt like survival. A week later, I was sitting in my kitchen when a knock echoed through the house. When I opened the door, Elaine was standing there. No lawyer, no arrogance, just a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days. Can we talk? She asked. I hesitated, then stepped aside. She sat at the table where we used to share coffee after visiting Dad. Her eyes were red, her hands trembling. I didn't come here to fight, she said softly. I need you to understand why I did it. I folded my arms. Understanding doesn't mean forgiving. I know. She looked down at her hands. When Mom died, I thought Dad would finally see me. But every time he looked at me, I could see the guilt in his eyes. He loved you because you were safe, the part of his life that wasn't built on shame. I was the mistake he couldn't undo. Her voice cracked. When he told me he was rewriting the will, I panicked. I thought he was erasing me completely. I didn't think it through. I just didn't want to disappear. Her words were raw, unpolished. But pain doesn't excuse deceit. You didn't disappear, I said quietly. You made sure I did, she wiped her eyes. If I drop the claim, will you? Will you at least tell the court I didn't force him? It took me a long moment to answer. Part of me wanted to say no, to let her drown in her own choices. But another part, the one Dad raised, whispered that vengeance never heals what grief breaks. I can't lie, I said finally. But I won't destroy you either. The truth will do that on its own. She nodded slowly, stood up, and without another word, walked out. I watched her go, feeling the strangest mix of anger and pity. It's hard to hate someone when you finally see the hole inside them. 2 days later, I got a call from Grant. She's agreed to settle, he said. She'll sign over the assets and you'll drop the criminal charges. Are you okay with that? I closed my eyes. I could fight her until she had nothing left. But what then? I'd still have to live with the noise of it all. Yes, I said. Let's end it. When I hung up, the house felt lighter. The kind of quiet that didn't hurt. That night, I found myself in Dad's study again. The air still smelled faintly of old books and cedar polish. I opened his drawer, the one he used to lock, and found a small, unopened envelope with my name on it. My breath caught as I unfolded the paper inside. Julia, if you're reading this, I'm probably gone. I hope you'll remember that what matters most isn't what I leave behind, but what I taught you: honesty, compassion, and courage. Money can be replaced. Peace cannot. My hands trembled as I folded it back. He'd known. Somehow, even as his life faded, he knew the storm would come. I whispered, "I'm trying, Dad," and set the letter down. Julia hadn't slept. Playing in loops, the confrontation, the shattered look on Elaine's face, the way Michael had stood frozen, his mouth open but no sound coming out. Now, sitting on the couch with a cold cup of tea, Julia felt hollow. Justice, if that's what she could even call it, didn't feel like victory. It felt like a wound that refused to stop bleeding. The doorbell rang. She flinched, half expecting the police, half hoping it was a bad dream. But when she opened the door, Elaine was standing there, disheveled, her face puffy, mascara smudged. She looked like someone who'd been crying for hours. "Can we talk?" Elaine's voice cracked. Julia hesitated but stepped aside. "Come in." Elaine moved stiffly, like she was carrying invisible weights. She sat on the couch, her hands trembling. The sight of her used to ignite anger in Julia. Now it only evoked pity. "I didn't sleep," Elaine whispered. "Michael left this morning. He didn't say a word, just left." Julia said nothing. She stared at the carpet, tracing the woven patterns with her eyes. Elaine exhaled shakily. "I know you hate me, and you have every right to. But what you did last night, you ruined us." Julia finally looked up, her tone level but cold. "No, Elaine. You ruined us. I just showed the truth." Elaine's eyes welled up. "You could have talked to me privately. You didn't have to destroy me in front of everyone." "I tried," Julia said sharply. "For months, you lied. You smiled to my face while—" Her voice broke. "You made me question my own instincts, my sanity." Tears slid down Elaine's cheeks. "I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened." Julia laughed bitterly. "Affairs don't just happen. Choices do. You made them." Elaine covered her face. "I lost everything. My husband's gone. My reputation's gone. My daughter hates me. You've won, Julia. Are you happy now?" The question hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Julia swallowed hard. Her hands were shaking now. "No," she said quietly. "I'm not." Elaine's sobs filled the room, raw and broken. Julia watched her crumble and felt an ache she couldn't name. She had wanted truth, not this, not another human being reduced to ashes. After a long silence, Julia stood. "You should go home. You need rest." Elaine looked up, her expression hollow. "Home? I don't even know where that is anymore." Julia didn't answer. She walked to the door and opened it. Elaine rose slowly, gave her one last devastated look, and walked out without another word. When the door closed, Julia leaned against it, feeling her knees weaken. She sank to the floor and covered her face. The sob came uninvited, deep, guttural, uncontrollable. For months, she had built this moment up in her mind, the day truth would set her free. But freedom was a myth. The truth had set her adrift instead, unanchored, hollowed out. Later that day, Julia walked to the small park near the Old Town Bridge. It was quiet, empty, except for a boy flying a kite on the hill. She sat on a bench, watching the kite rise and dip in the wind. She thought about Michael. He hadn't called, hadn't texted. There was no closure, just silence. Maybe that was his way of saying goodbye. She thought about Elaine, too. Broken, yes, but also human. Julia couldn't deny the flicker of empathy crawling into her chest. Revenge had made her powerful, but forgiveness, even the thought of it, made her feel human again. A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Didn't expect to find you here. It was Daniel, Elaine's brother. He looked cautious, almost nervous. Julia gave a faint smile. You always find people when they're hiding. He sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. Elaine's with my mom. She's not doing well, Julia nodded. I know. She told me everything, Daniel said after a pause. And she told me what you did last night. Honestly, I don't blame you. Julia's eyes welled up. Then you're the only one. He shook his head. No, you did what most people are too scared to do. You made people see the truth. That takes courage, Julia. But it also costs you peace. She sighed. It cost me more than that. It cost me myself. Daniel studied her face. Then maybe now's the time to rebuild. Start small. New projects. New people. Something that isn't just pain. Julia smiled faintly. I don't even know where to begin. He looked at her softly. Begin where it hurts the most. That's where healing starts. That night, Julia returned home and found an envelope on her doorstep. No name, just her address written in Michael's familiar handwriting. Her heart pounded as she tore it open. Inside was a single note. I don't know how to face what we've become. You were right. I betrayed not just you but myself. I need time to understand how. I'm sorry for everything. Julia read it twice. No anger rose this time, only a weary understanding. She folded the letter carefully, set it on the table, and whispered, So do I. Then she turned off the lights, walked to her room, and opened the window. The cool night air brushed her face, carrying the faint scent of rain. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like running from the silence. She just let it fill her, because justice, she realized, wasn't about punishment. It was about truth, and learning to live with what it reveals. And as the rain began to fall, softly, steadily, Julia let it wash over her, not as penance, but as release. The news traveled faster than Julia ever could have imagined. By Monday morning, the quiet suburban bubble that had always wrapped around their lives was punctured, shredded open by whispers, forwarded messages, and hushed gasps. The story, fragments of truth layered with speculation, spread through the office, the neighborhood, and the little social circle where Julia and Elaine had once been inseparable. Julia hadn't intended for it to become public beyond the dinner party. But truth, once set free, grows legs. At the office, the air had changed. Elaine hadn't come in that day. Her desk, usually cluttered with coffee mugs and floral notebooks, sat empty. A few co-workers stole glances at Julia as she passed by, some with quiet sympathy, others with the kind of curiosity that only human gossip can ignite. At noon, Julia was called into HR. Julia, said Ms. Turner, the HR head, her voice steady but kind. We've heard about what happened. I want you to know we're sorry this reached the workplace like this. Are you holding up? Julia nodded stiffly. I'm fine, Ms. Turner hesitated. Elaine won't be coming back for a while. She requested a leave of absence. It might even become permanent. A strange emptiness bloomed in Julia's chest. She had imagined this, the fallout, the visible consequence. But now that it was real, it didn't feel like triumph. After the meeting, she stood by the office window, looking out at the gray cityscape. Everything seemed muted, like the world was adjusting its colors to match her. That evening, her phone buzzed with messages. Is it true about Michael and Elaine? I can't believe she did that to you. You deserve better, Julia. Stay strong. Julia didn't reply to any of them. She muted the chat and put her phone away. She didn't want pity. She wanted quiet. Across town, the consequences hit Elaine like a storm. Her friends, the same ones who once adored her, began to disappear. Coffee invitations dried up. Group chats fell silent. Her daughter, Lily, refused to speak to her. She sat in her living room, surrounded by reminders of a life that suddenly felt foreign. The house felt larger now, emptier. Every photograph, the smiling faces, the vacations, the dinners, looked like a lie she had been living inside. Her phone rang. It was Daniel. Elaine. His voice was tired. Mom's heard. She's upset. Elaine closed her eyes. Of course she is. She says she doesn't want to see you right now. There was silence on the line. Elaine nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I understand. Daniel hesitated. You should know. Julia didn't spread it. People from the party talked. Someone posted online. I don't blame her, Elaine whispered. She had every right. Her voice broke, soft and small. I just didn't think the truth could destroy everything. By the end of the week, Michael's absence had become official. He'd moved out of their apartment, leaving behind only a short message through a mutual friend. He needed space and time. Julia didn't chase him. She was done chasing ghosts, but when she went grocery shopping on Saturday morning, she noticed the shift, how familiar faces in the aisles seemed to look at her differently. Some smiled kindly, some avoided eye contact, others whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. She's the one whose husband cheated. She exposed her best friend, right? Julia moved through the aisles quietly, her basket trembling in her hand. She didn't want to be a story. She just wanted to be unseen again. At the checkout counter, Mrs. Patel, the elderly cashier who'd known her for years, placed a gentle hand on hers. "You did the right thing, dear," she said softly. "Sometimes the truth hurts more than lies, but it's cleaner." Julia's eyes welled up. "It doesn't feel clean," Mrs. Patel gave a small smile. "Because you're human. But you'll heal." On Sunday morning, Julia went to the community center for the charity event she'd been helping organize for months. It was the first time she'd gone out socially since the dinner. The hall buzzed with chatter, laughter, music, the hum of volunteers setting up tables. When Julia walked in, conversations dimmed slightly. Heads turned. She smiled politely and went about her work, arranging name tags, checking the raffle list. After a few minutes, a familiar voice called her name. "Julia!" It was Mrs. Green, one of the senior coordinators. She walked over, her face bright with warmth. "I was hoping you'd come. Don't mind the whispers, darling." "People always talk more when they're uncomfortable with truth." Julia managed a weak smile. "I didn't expect to be a topic of conversation." Mrs. Green's tone softened. "You'll be yesterday's news soon enough. But you'll still have your integrity." That lasts longer than gossip. Julia's throat tightened. "It doesn't feel like integrity. It feels like exile." Mrs. Green squeezed her hand. "Sometimes they're the same thing." That evening, after the event ended, Julia lingered outside the hall. The sky was turning pink, the air cool and gentle. She saw Daniel walking toward her, his hands in his pockets. "Elaine asked me to give you this," he said quietly. Handing her a small sealed envelope, Julia frowned. "What is it?" "She said it's not an apology, just something she needs you to read." Julia hesitated but took it. "How is she?" He sighed. "Lost, but she's facing it finally," Julia nodded. "That's something." When she got home, she sat at her kitchen table and opened the letter. "Julia, you were right. The truth matters, even when it burns everything around it. I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope you find peace sooner than I will." Elaine Julia folded the letter carefully and placed it beside Michael's note. 2 pieces of paper, 2 ghosts of what once was. As night settled, she stood by the window again, watching the city lights flicker. The storm had passed, but the air still carried its weight. The truth was out now, in homes, offices, and hearts. It had rearranged everything, but for the first time, Julia felt something faint. Not relief, not victory, but a fragile sense of stillness, the kind that comes when a wound has finally stopped bleeding, even if it still aches. 2 weeks passed before Julia saw Elaine again. It happened at the Sunday service. Julia had avoided church since the fallout. Too many polite smiles, too many questions dressed as condolences. But that morning, something in her wanted stillness, not isolation. She sat near the back, in a pew partly shaded by the stained glass, the kind of place where she could disappear. Halfway through the service, the side door opened quietly. Elaine walked in. The air in the room seemed to shift, a faint collective murmur of recognition. She looked thinner, smaller somehow, her once perfect posture bent by something heavier than guilt. She wasn't wearing her usual soft colors or polished pearls. Just a simple gray dress, no makeup, no armor. Julia's chest tightened. Elaine walked slowly down the aisle, eyes fixed ahead, ignoring the looks. Some faces softened with pity, others hardened with silent judgment. No one spoke. When she sat down a few rows ahead, Julia caught the faint tremor of her shoulders, the quiet, rhythmic kind that comes from trying not to cry. The choir began to sing, but Julia couldn't hear them. All she heard was the echo of that night at Elaine's house, the sound of porcelain breaking, and the word forgive lingering like a bruise. After the service, the congregation spilled out into the courtyard. Conversations buzzed. the way they always did, about groceries, children, the weather. But this time something had changed. Elaine didn't rush off. She stood near the old oak tree, clutching her handbag like a shield. People passed her, some avoiding her completely, others offering brief nods. Then Mrs. Green approached. Julia watched from a distance as the older woman touched Elaine's arm gently, spoke a few quiet words, then walked away. Elaine looked up and saw Julia watching her. For a long moment neither moved. Finally, Elaine walked toward her. "Hi," she said softly. Her voice frayed. "Hi." The silence between them felt vast, like a bridge burned but still smoldering. "I didn't think you'd come," Elaine said. "I almost didn't." Elaine nodded slowly. "I wanted to face people. To stop hiding." Julia studied her. "How's Lily?" "She's staying with Daniel for now." Her eyes flickered. "She barely talks to me. Says she needs time." Julia swallowed. "Maybe time's all she needs." Elaine gave a small, bitter smile. "Time and a new mother," Julia exhaled. "You're not the only one she's angry at." Elaine's eyes met hers. "Do you hate me?" Julia hesitated. "No, I did. But hate, it takes too much space." Tears filled Elaine's eyes. "I didn't just lose Dad's trust or Michael's friendship. I lost myself. I wake up every morning wondering who I was trying to be when I did it." Julia's voice softened. "Someone who wanted to be loved." Elaine's breath hitched. "And now I'm not sure anyone ever will." Julia looked at her. Really looked. At the exhaustion, the trembling hands, the quiet sincerity that couldn't rewrite what she'd done, but somehow made her human again. "Maybe that's where healing starts," Julia said quietly. "When you stop expecting love to erase the damage." Elaine nodded, tears slipping freely now. "You sound like Dad." "Maybe that's a good thing." They stood there in the fading morning light, two women bound by blood and broken trust, surrounded by murmuring lives that would soon move on to other scandals. For the first time in months, Julia didn't feel the urge to turn away. That evening, Julia received an email from the community newsletter. Subject, Special Acknowledgement, Julia Anderson, for her contribution to this month's charity drive and continued integrity in times of personal hardship. It wasn't grand. It wasn't an award. But it felt like quiet acceptance, the community's way of saying, "We see you," not the story about you. When she walked into the office the next morning, people smiled, not the forced, pitying smiles she'd grown used to, but small, genuine ones. A coworker left a coffee cup on her desk with a sticky note. "You're stronger than most." Julia smiled faintly. Meanwhile, Elaine began volunteering at the local shelter. Word spread, not through gossip this time, but through quiet mentions. "She's trying to make things right," people said. "Maybe she deserves a second chance." She didn't try to justify herself anymore. When someone asked about the scandal, she didn't defend or explain. She simply said, "I did wrong," and somehow that humility started softening the whispers. One evening, Julia walked into the shelter unannounced. Elaine was in the kitchen helping serve dinner. She looked up in surprise. Julia smiled. "They said you make good soup." Elaine laughed softly, a sound that cracked but didn't break. "I try." For a moment they just stood there. The noise of clattering plates and chatter filled the room, but it all seemed distant. "Maybe someday," Julia said quietly, "we'll sit down and talk. Properly." Elaine nodded, eyes bright. "I'd like that." Julia reached out, touched her hand briefly, then turned to leave. Outside, the evening was cool. The city lights shimmered in puddles from a recent rain, reflecting a kind of calm that hadn't existed for months. For the first time, Julia felt something close to peace. Not the sharp, triumphant kind she once imagined, but the kind that arrives gently, without ceremony, and stays. In the end, the world hadn't given her back everything she'd lost, but it had given her something else. Quiet dignity, the rarest kind of justice, and in that stillness, Julia finally understood. Truth destroys, yes, but sometimes what it destroys are the walls that kept you from being real. 6 months passed before I realized I'd stopped checking the mail with dread. There had been weeks when every envelope, every number that appeared on my phone screen felt like another potential wound. Some new reminder that what I'd lost couldn't be reclaimed by signatures or settlements. But time, as it does, moved quietly, like water smoothing over stone. I was living differently now, simpler. Dad's house had finally sold, and I'd used part of my inheritance to buy a small place on the edge of town. Not grand, just enough for me and the life I was learning to live again. There was a porch with a creaky swing, a backyard that smelled of rain and soil, and neighbors who waved without asking questions. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I'd sit outside with a cup of tea and listen to the crickets. The world didn't feel as heavy anymore. There was peace in knowing I didn't have to fight anyone to keep it. One Friday afternoon, I got a call from Daniel, Elaine's ex-husband. I hadn't heard from him since the court settlement. He sounded nervous. "Hey, Julia, I hope I'm not bothering you." "Not at all," I said, though my pulse quickened. "It's just, Elaine's moving next month, out of state. She asked me to help with a few things, and she wondered if you'd come by." She didn't want to ask directly. For a moment, I couldn't find words. Part of me wanted to say no, to stay in this bubble of calm I'd fought to build. But something deeper stirred, a tug of unfinished business. "All right," I said finally. "I'll come." Her apartment was smaller than I expected. Clean, but stripped down, as if she'd been quietly erasing her own history. Boxes lined the floor, labeled kitchen, books, Lily's things. Elaine looked older, not by years but by weight, the invisible kind. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. I nodded, glancing around. "You're really leaving?" She smiled faintly. "New start. I found a position at a local community center in Portland. Nothing glamorous, but honest work." I could tell she meant that word, honest. It had become her new compass. We packed in silence for a while. The quiet wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was respectful, like two people walking through the ruins of a house they'd both lived in once. After an hour, Elaine handed me a small wooden box. "Dad gave me this years ago," she said. "I think it should have gone to you." I opened it slowly. Inside were two things: Dad's old wristwatch and a letter. The handwriting stopped me cold. Those uneven, careful strokes that used to sign my report cards and grocery lists. "Julia, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And if I've failed you in life, I hope this makes up for a small part of it. Family is rarely simple. Sometimes love comes in broken shapes, and we mistake possession for protection. Don't carry anger longer than you need to. It'll turn your kindness into armor, and that's not who you are. Remember, love doesn't mean you have to stay close. Sometimes it just means you wish them peace from afar." Dad, I folded the letter back carefully, my throat tight. Elaine's eyes shimmered. I didn't read it before. I knew it wasn't meant for me. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "You did a terrible thing," I said, voice trembling. "But you're trying to make it right." "That matters," she nodded, tears spilling freely now. "I wish I could take it back, not for the money, but for how I made you look at me." I gave a small, sad smile. "Maybe forgiveness isn't about forgetting. Maybe it's just choosing to stop hurting yourself with the memory." She exhaled shakily. "I hope you find peace, Julia." "I already am," I said quietly. "And I hope you do too." When I left her apartment, the sky was painted in soft pinks and oranges, the kind of evening Dad used to call gentle weather. I sat in my car for a while, the watch in my palm, its worn leather band warm from my touch. The second hand still ticked faintly, steady and alive. Time hadn't stopped when everything fell apart. It had just changed its rhythm, slower, more deliberate, and maybe that's what healing really is. Not forgetting the hurt, but learning to move with it. As I drove home, I didn't look back. Not because I wanted to leave her behind, but because for the first time, I trusted that I didn't need to keep looking over my shoulder to make sure I was safe. I already was. The following months unfolded in quiet colors. No grand moments, no cinematic endings, just the slow, steady rhythm of life mending itself. I found work at a small nonprofit in town, managing community outreach programs. It wasn't high-paying, but it was purposeful. Most days, I spent my mornings organizing food drives, meeting local families, listening to stories that reminded me how loss and hope often share the same breath. I began volunteering at the local hospice, too, the same kind of place where my father had spent his final days. The first time I walked in, the antiseptic smell hit me like memory itself. But this time I didn't flinch. I smiled at the patients, the nurses, and even at the sound of the beeping monitors. It felt like I had finally made peace with that chapter of my life. Sometimes, when the afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, I'd sit by a patient's bed and just listen. They talked about their regrets, the children who stopped visiting, the love letters they never sent. And I'd think about my father, how he had faced his own ending with honesty and fear, and how his last message to me had been about forgiveness, not fairness. Those moments humbled me. One Saturday, while clearing out the last few boxes from my garage, I found an old photo album I hadn't touched in years. It was thick with dust, its spine cracked. Inside were photos from childhood, birthdays, vacations, graduations, all the small fragments of a life before the fracture. Near the back, tucked between pages, I found something unexpected, a picture of me, Dad, and Elaine. I didn't remember the occasion, but we were sitting on the porch, eating watermelon. Dad's arm was around both of us. We looked happy, not perfectly so, but in that effortless way families sometimes are before truth gets in the way. I stared at that photo for a long time. Then, slowly, I placed it on the mantel in my living room. Not out of nostalgia, but acknowledgement. Because no matter how much pain came after, that moment had been real. And part of healing, I realized, is not erasing the parts of your story that hurt. It's learning to see them without wincing. A few weeks later, I received a letter, handwritten, neat, with my name on the front in a familiar script. It was from Elaine. Dear Julia, I don't expect this to change anything, but I wanted you to know I'm doing better. Portland has been kind to me. I work with a group of women rebuilding after addiction and family loss. Sometimes I see pieces of myself in them. The brokenness, the fear, the hunger to be forgiven. Lily's coming to visit next month. We've started talking again slowly. She says she's proud of me for owning what I did. That means more than I can explain. I still think about Dad every day. And you. I'm grateful that you didn't destroy me when you could have. That mercy taught me more than justice ever could. If you're ever in Portland, I'd like to see you. No expectations, no apologies, just two people sharing coffee, maybe silence, maybe peace. Love, Elaine. I sat there for a while, tracing her handwriting with my thumb. The edges of the letter curled slightly, soft from being held too tightly, and for the first time, I smiled without bitterness. That night, I visited the beach, a place Dad used to take me when life felt too loud. The air was cool, the ocean restless, whispering its endless rhythm against the shore. I stood there, shoes off, the sand damp beneath my feet. The tide rolled in, erasing every footprint I left behind. It felt symbolic somehow. The idea that life always keeps moving, reshaping what's been written. I thought about everything I'd lost. The home, the certainty, the version of family I used to believe in. But I also thought about what I'd gained. Clarity, strength, forgiveness that didn't depend on anyone else's remorse. And then, quietly, almost like a prayer, I said into the wind, "Thank you, Dad, for the lesson I never wanted but needed most." I stayed there until the horizon darkened and the first stars appeared. Steady, silent, enduring. When I finally turned to leave, I realized something simple yet profound. I wasn't walking away from the past anymore. I was walking towards something new. Maybe that's all healing really is. Not forgetting who hurt you, but remembering who you became because of it. And as I drove home under the soft hum of streetlights, I knew that no matter what came next, I would be all right. Because peace, I'd learned, isn't what you find when the storm ends. It's what you build while it's still raining. The sound of the morning was different. Now, softer, peaceful. The wind that once carried arguments and accusations now drifted through the oak trees like a gentle hymn. Julia sat on her porch with a cup of chamomile tea, watching sunlight spill over the edge of the lawn. The house, her father's house, felt alive again, not haunted by paperwork, greed, or echoes of betrayal, but by something she hadn't felt in years. Stillness. Months had passed since the final hearing. The newspapers had moved on. Elaine had quietly left town after the fallout. Some said she was staying with a cousin up north, trying to start over. Julia never confirmed it. She didn't need to. There was no satisfaction in knowing where her sister had gone. The truth had already taken enough from them both. What mattered now was what remained. Inside, the house had changed. Julia repainted the living room in soft cream and sunlight yellow, colors her mother used to love. The piano that had gathered dust for years now sat polished, with her mother's old music sheets spread across it. Sometimes, on evenings when the world felt too quiet, Julia would play a tune her mother had taught her, and for a few precious moments, she'd feel like the walls were listening again. Healing hadn't come overnight. The first few weeks after the verdict had felt like walking through fog, relief tangled with grief, justice blurred with guilt. Julia had gotten what she fought for, but it hadn't brought the peace she expected. Because peace, she learned, isn't about being right. It's about being ready to let go. She began volunteering at a community center that helped women facing financial disputes and inheritance battles. There, she met others, daughters, widows, and sisters, each with their own story of loss and deception. Some had been stripped of everything by relatives. Others just wanted their voices heard. Julia listened. She didn't preach, didn't pity. She simply sat beside them, sharing what it meant to survive something that changes the way you see family forever. One woman, Marcy, once asked her, "Do you ever forgive them? The ones who betrayed you?" Julia had paused. The question stayed in her chest longer than she expected. Finally, she said softly, "Forgiveness isn't for them. It's for the part of you that refuses to live in anger." Marcy had nodded, tears in her eyes. That night, Julia returned home and stood in front of her father's portrait. She hadn't looked at it in months. His eyes, warm, steady, seemed to hold a kind of quiet knowing, as if he'd seen all this coming, but trusted her to endure it. "I did what I thought was right," she whispered. "I hope you'd understand." The silence that followed didn't feel heavy. It felt approving. In time, Julia started writing again. Not the brittle journal entries filled with courtroom notes and bitterness, but essays, small reflections on truth, loss, and love. One of them, titled "The Inheritance We Can't Divide," was published in a local magazine. Readers began sending letters, people who had faced betrayal, people who still struggled to forgive. Her story, though painful, gave them language for their own wounds. That, Julia realized, was its final purpose. Not revenge, not reputation, but connection. She spent her weekends tending the garden her mother had once planted, roses, tulips, hydrangeas. Elaine had always loved those flowers too, and though Julia would never say it out loud, she sometimes caught herself hoping her sister had found a way to start over. Because no matter how sharp betrayal feels, it doesn't have to end every bond. Some just change form, like branches that break, but still cast shade in memory. As the sun began to dip behind the hills, Julia looked at the small stone path leading from the porch to the garden gate. She remembered walking that path as a little girl, holding her father's hand, laughing at nothing in particular. Back then, she never thought love could fracture. Now she knew it could, but she also knew it could survive in quieter ways. Sometimes, I sit by that same window where everything started, the place I once watched Elaine drive away after our father's funeral, and I think about how strange life is, how it can circle back, forcing you to look at the very things you tried to forget. If you had told me 2 years ago that I would forgive my sister, I would have laughed. I didn't think forgiveness was even possible after what she did. She didn't just take money or property, she took memories, trust, pieces of the past that I thought belonged to both of us. But now, when I look back, I realize something I couldn't see then. Elaine wasn't the only one lost in that house. I was too. We were two women trying to claim pieces of a man who loved us both, but who left us without instructions on how to love each other. She carried resentment that had been building since childhood. I carried pride, the kind that hides behind righteousness. Maybe, in her own twisted way, she thought she was reclaiming what life had denied her. That doesn't excuse it, but it explains the ache. It's easy to call someone a thief, a liar, a betrayer. But it takes courage to ask why they became one. Sometimes the answer is uglier than the act itself. Neglect, jealousy, longing. Things we don't talk about because they make us human. I've learned that justice and peace don't always sit at the same table. Winning doesn't always feel like victory. When I walked out of that courthouse, the world called me brave. But in the silence of my car, I felt hollow, like I'd fought a storm, only to find myself standing in its wreckage. It took time, long, tearful, humbling time to realize that healing doesn't come from punishment. It comes from reclaiming your own heart from bitterness. I used to replay that final confrontation with Elaine in my mind, over and over, imagining different endings. Sometimes I won the argument more gracefully. Sometimes I let her walk away without saying anything at all. But lately I've stopped rewriting it. Because the truth is, maybe that moment was exactly what it needed to be. Messy, painful, honest. Life doesn't give us clean endings. It gives us lessons wrapped in heartbreak. I've started keeping one of Elaine's old scarves on the hook by the door. It's silly, I know. But on cold mornings when I catch its faint perfume, jasmine, just like she used to wear, it reminds me that love, no matter how fractured, leaves traces that time can't erase. I don't know if she'll ever come back. Maybe one day she'll call. Maybe she won't, but if she does, I'll answer. Not because I've forgotten, but because I finally understand that forgiveness isn't about opening the door for them. It's about unbolting the one inside yourself. You can't carry pain forever without letting it shape you into someone smaller. I don't want to live small anymore. So tonight, as the crickets sing and the world outside my window begins to blur into dusk, I want to ask you something, not as a storyteller, but as someone who's been broken and rebuilt by truth. Have you ever loved someone so deeply that even after they betrayed you, a part of you still wished they'd come home? And if they did, if they stood at your door tomorrow, looking older, humbled, carrying their mistakes in trembling hands, would you close the door to protect your peace? Or open it, just once, to see if love could survive what pride destroyed? I don't have the right answer. I only know what I chose. I chose peace. I chose to stop waiting for apologies that might never come. I chose to fill my home with laughter again, not ghosts. And maybe that's all any of us can do. Make peace with the stories that didn't end the way we wanted, and still find a way to keep living with grace. Because at the end of every betrayal, there's still a heartbeat that deserves to rest.